Somewhere past the last marked trail, the map runs out. That's where we live. Out here, there's an old saying. What sees you first follows you longest. So here's the deal. Subscribe and hit that like button, or you're walking back alone. We're chasing 10,000 souls by the end of 2026. Now, let's dive into tonight's story. I've told this story only a handful of times in my life, and every single time I tell it, the same quiet falls over whoever is listening. It is the particular kind of quiet where nobody wants to say out loud that they don't believe you, but nobody wants to be the one who laughs either. I was 32 years old in 1878, foreman of a logging outfit cutting hardwood along a tributary of the Congo River in country that had barely felt the weight of a boot that wasn't born there. What happened to my camp during the final week of that dry season is the reason I no longer sleep easily near open water, the reason certain sounds at night still bring me fully upright in bed, decades later, and the reason I have never once, in all the years since, set foot back in that part of the world. We had 26 men working under me when the season began. Most were local rivermen, hired out of the villages downstream, strong and quiet and better with an axe than any man I had ever worked beside back home in England. A handful were contract labourers who had come inland the same way I had, chasing wages and the promise of a foreman's letter waiting for them at the end of the job. We had 2 mules for hauling timber, a cook named Thomas Bell, who was past 60 and had already outlived 3 other logging camps before he ever signed on with ours, and a physician named Dr. Henri Beaumont, a Frenchman trained in Paris who had joined the expedition mainly to study fever among the workers and ended up doing a great deal more doctoring than his contract had ever promised him. Our camp sat in a clearing we had cut ourselves at a bend in the river, where the timber grew thick and tall and worth every bit of trouble it took to haul out through difficult country. It was the driest part of the season, so the river had pulled back low against its banks, exposing wide flats of cracked mud along the shore, and the undergrowth had thinned enough that old game trails showed clearly through the brush. None of us remembered cutting those trails ourselves, and none of the local men would take credit for them either, which struck me as odd at the time, though I didn't think much of it beyond a passing curiosity. I should tell you plainly, before I go any further, that I did not believe in things I could not see, touch, or put a bullet through. I'd spent 6 years in that country by then, and in that time, I'd heard every kind of campfire story a man could invent to keep himself entertained through a long, humid night with nothing else to do. Spirits living in the water, voices calling down from the canopy after dark, men who wandered off one evening and were simply never seen again, and other men who swore up and down they knew exactly why, though none of them could ever quite explain it in a way that held together in daylight. I wrote every one of those stories off as the natural consequence of exhaustion and imagination working overtime in a place that gave a man far too much of both. I kept a leather ledger of every worker's wages, balanced to the last coin, and I took a certain quiet pride in being the last man in any camp to believe a ghost story, the last man to flinch at a shadow, the last man anyone could rattle with talk around a fire. That pride cost me more than I can properly explain. Thomas Bell tried to warn me from very nearly the first week we set up in that clearing, and I've thought a great deal since then about how much patience he showed me, considering how little I showed him in return. It started small. A comment here, a look there. Bell had a habit, I noticed early on, of glancing toward the tree line to the north of camp every evening, just as the light began to fail, the same stretch of forest each time, as though he were counting something only he could see. I asked him about it once, half joking, and he just shook his head and told me it was nothing, an old man's habit, and went back to stirring whatever was in the pot over the fire. I let it go. I had timber quotas to worry about and 26 men to keep fed and organised, and I didn't have room in my thinking for an old cook's superstitions. It was on the 4th night, though, that he finally sat me down properly and told me what was actually on his mind. We were near the cook fire after the evening meal, most of the men already down in their tents, a few stragglers talking low near the mule pen about nothing in particular. Bell had a habit of turning a piece of wood over and over in his big, weathered hands whenever he was working himself up to say something he expected to be laughed at, and that night, he turned that piece of wood so long and so slowly that I finally asked him outright what was troubling him. He told me the rivermen had a name for something that was supposed to live in the old growth forest, to the north of our clearing, deeper in than any of us had cut. He wouldn't repeat the actual word for it. He said it wasn't his word to give away, that it belonged to people who had earned the right to speak it and he hadn't, not after only a few years working alongside them. But he told me what it meant well enough, translated as best he could into an English tongue that clearly wasn't built to hold the shape of it. The long hunger, more or less, was the closest he could manage. He said it came out during the driest weeks of the year, when the smaller game thinned out and the water pulled back from its usual course, forcing everything living in that forest closer together, closer to the river, closer to camps just like ours. He said it took whatever it needed from whoever happened to be standing in its way when it finally decided to come looking. He told me his own grandfather, decades before, had refused to graze cattle anywhere near a particular bend of this same river because animals disappeared there every single dry season without fail, and they were always taken in groups of no fewer than 3 at a time. Never one, never 2, always 3 or more, as though the number itself carried some meaning to whatever was doing the taking, some threshold that had to be crossed before it was satisfied. He said he'd asked his grandfather once why 3, and the old man had only told him that some hungers don't stop until they've proven to themselves that they can still catch more than one thing at a time. I remember that detail sticking with me longer than I wanted it to. He told me that 2 of our river workers had gone unusually quiet since we set up camp in this particular clearing. Men who had been talkative and easy before, and that those same 2 men had flatly refused to sleep anywhere near a fallen, hollowed-out tree trunk sitting at the edge of the tree line, even after I'd pointed out to them with some irritation that there was open, level ground there, and better shelter from the wind than anywhere else in the clearing. I'd assumed at the time it was simple stubbornness, or discomfort with rotting wood, or any of a dozen ordinary explanations. Bell told me it was something else entirely. I told him it sounded exactly like the kind of story a cook tells to keep the younger men close to the fire at night, where he can keep an eye on them and make sure they eat their supper before wandering off to whatever mischief young men get up to in strange country. Bell didn't argue with me. He never did, not once through the whole of it. He just nodded slowly, the particular nod of an old man who has already decided you'll learn the truth of it on your own time, in your own way, and there's no sense wasting breath trying to rush you there. He went back to turning that piece of wood in his hands without another word, and I went to check on the mules before turning in, feeling faintly pleased with myself for not having been taken in by another campfire tale. 2 nights after that conversation, I woke somewhere in the deep, black hours of the night to the sound of our mules screaming. I grabbed a lantern and stumbled out my tent to find them straining hard against their tether, eyes rolled back white, absolutely refusing to be calmed no matter how gently I spoke to them or how long I stood at their heads with a hand pressed to each muzzle. One of them had rubbed a raw patch into its own foreleg, trying to pull free of the rope. I'd never seen animals behave that way. Not from thunder, not from the smell of a nearby predator, not from anything I'd encountered before, in 6 years of camps just like this one. I walked the perimeter of the clearing with the lantern held out ahead of me, telling myself I was only checking for a leopard, and found long furrows carved into the soft earth just past the tree line, close to where the workers had refused to make their beds. They were wide, they were deep, and pressed into the ground along both edges was an odd, evenly spaced ridging the kind of mark left by something dragged forward with real and considerable weight behind it, moving with a purpose rather than the scattered wandering of any animal I knew. I crouched down and ran my fingers along one of those ridges, feeling the precise, almost deliberate spacing of it, and told myself it was a fallen branch, pulled loose somehow by wind. There had been no wind that night, or any night that entire week. I told myself the excuse anyway because it was easier to carry than the alternative, and I said nothing to the men the next morning. I told myself I didn't want to spread panic over a scuffed patch of dirt that any number of ordinary things might have made. Looking back on it honestly, I think I simply didn't want to be the man who admitted, even to himself, that he believed in something he couldn't shoot. 2 days passed after that without incident, though I noticed the men working the north edge of our cutting area growing steadily quieter, exchanging looks I pretended not to see, taking longer breaks than usual, and sticking closer together than the work strictly required. I told myself it was ordinary fatigue. The heat that week had been especially brutal, even for that country, and I had every reason available to explain away what I didn't want to look at directly. It was on the 5th day, during the felling of a particularly large hardwood near the edge of our cleared ground, that one of the workers called out that he'd found something in the underbrush a short distance off. I walked over with Dr. Beaumont, expecting some ordinary curiosity, a snake skin or a strange root formation, the kind of thing men in unfamiliar country get excited about and forget within the hour. What we found instead was a section of shed exoskeleton, curved and hard as a dinner plate, easily the width of a man's chest, lying half buried in leaf litter, as though it had simply been left behind, the way a snake leaves its old skin when it outgrows it. Beaumont turned it over carefully in his gloved hands, examining the underside, running his thumb along a row of small, evenly spaced ridges that lined one edge. He didn't say much at first. He asked one of the workers, through our translator, whether anyone recognized what kind of animal might shed something like this, and the answer he received was silence, and then a slow, deliberate step backward from every man standing close enough to see it clearly. Beaumont wrapped the fragment in cloth and carried it back to his tent, and that night I saw him studying it by lantern light for a long while, turning it over and over exactly the way Bell turned his pieces of wood, though for entirely different reasons. I asked him what he made of it. He told me, with the careful precision of a man choosing his words to sound more confident than he actually felt, that it was almost certainly from some unusually large species of crustacean or arthropod previously undocumented in this particular stretch of the river basin, and that he intended to write a full account of it once we returned to the coast. He seemed, for the first time since I'd known him, genuinely excited rather than simply dutiful about his work. I did not share his excitement. Something about the size and shape of that fragment sat wrong with me in a way I couldn't name. The following evening gave me one of the better conversations of that whole miserable expedition, and it remains the one I think about most, even now, even after everything that came after it. We had a young logger in the crew named Samuel Crow, 19 years old, easy to like, always the first man to volunteer for whatever job nobody else wanted to touch, saving nearly every coin of his pay to send home to his mother in Matadi. He had a way of talking about the future that made it sound entirely certain, entirely solid, the way only a very young man can talk about things he has no actual proof of yet. That evening he sat with me by the fire long after most of the others had turned in, and he asked me what England was like, whether the rivers there ran anywhere near as wide as this one, whether a man could really make something of himself back home if he saved carefully enough, and came back carrying a good reference from a foreman who trusted him. I told him about the River Thames, about the grey stone bridges and the smell of coal smoke that hung over everything in the colder months, and he listened with the particular hunger of a young man imagining a life he hadn't lived yet. I told him that when this contract ended, I would write him the finest letter of recommendation any foreman on that river had ever put to paper, and I meant every word of it. He grinned at me, like I had handed him something solid he could carry in his pocket for the rest of his life, something he could take out and look at whenever his own doubts got the better of him. We sat there talking long past, when either of us should have gone to sleep, and at one point he asked me, almost as an afterthought, whether I believed any of what the older men said about the north side of the clearing. I told him no, of course not, and watched something in his shoulders relax slightly at hearing it, as though my confidence alone was enough to settle something in him. I wish now I had told him the truth, which was that I didn't know what I believed, and that not knowing frightened me more than I was willing to admit to a 19-year-old boy who trusted my judgment completely. The next morning, he volunteered to fetch water from the creek beyond the tree line. The same direction, though I didn't think of it until much later, as the furrows I had never mentioned to anyone. He never came back. We noticed his absence perhaps 20 minutes after he'd left, when Belle asked where the water had gotten to, and nobody could answer him. I organised the search almost immediately, walking the same path Crow would have taken toward the creek, calling his name the whole way. We found his water pail sitting upright at the edge of the creek, completely undisturbed, still half full of clear water. There were no footprints leading away from it in any direction at all, not toward the water, not back toward camp, nothing. The mud along the bank was soft enough to hold a clear print for hours, and it held nothing except the single undisturbed set of prints leading up to where he must have knelt to fill the pail. It was as though he'd simply ceased to exist, somewhere between one step and the next, the world folding shut behind him without so much as a ripple. We searched for hours, spreading out further and further from the creek, calling his name until our voices went hoarse and the light began to fail. No blood anywhere. No torn clothing caught on a branch. No sign of a struggle of any kind, nothing to suggest violence, only that terrible, total absence of evidence, which somehow felt worse than any evidence of violence could have. 30 yards further into the brush, well past where any reasonable search would normally extend, one of the men called out that he'd found something, and we gathered around one more of those long, deep grooves pressed into the earth. This one was still damp, glistening faintly in the failing light, as though it had been made within the hour, as though whatever made it had passed directly beneath our feet while we called uselessly into the trees for a boy who was never going to answer us again. That night was the first night nobody in camp slept properly. I sat up with my rifle across my knees until the sky began to lighten, and I was not the only one. Dr. Beaumont refused at first to accept that anything unnatural had happened to Crow. He was a rational man through and through, trained in the finest medical schools Paris had to offer, and he set himself the task of finding an explanation that made sense within the world he understood, the same careful, methodical world that had made him so excited about that shed fragment only days before. He guessed at a large, constricting snake, one of the pythons known to grow to considerable size in that region. He guessed at a crocodile that had wandered unusually far from the riverbank, hunting water during the driest months. He knelt beside that damp groove in the dirt with a small hand lens pressed close to his eye, studying the ridged pattern for what felt like a very long time, longer than seemed necessary for a man simply confirming a theory he already believed. I watched his face change while he studied it. Something in his expression shifted, went still, in a way I hadn't seen on him before, not even when we'd found the shed fragment. He didn't say a word about what he'd noticed. He simply stood, brushed the dirt from the knees of his trousers with two sharp, almost violent strokes of his hand, and stayed unusually quiet for the rest of that day, answering questions from the men in short, distracted sentences that weren't like him at all. Over the following 2 days, Beaumont barely slept. I would pass his tent at all hours and see the lantern, still burning, his shadow bent over that fragment of shell, over the notes he was compiling, over sketches he made and then scratched out and made again. I asked him once directly what he thought we were dealing with, and he told me, without quite meeting my eyes, that he wasn't yet prepared to say, that he needed more evidence before he could commit himself to a conclusion that would sound to any reasonable person back home entirely insane. I told him I would take his best guess over his silence, and he looked at me for a long moment before saying quietly that if his measurements of the shed fragment were correct, and if the creature that shed it had grown proportionally since, then we were looking at something considerably larger than our supply wagon, and that this was, in his words, an impossibility he could not yet reconcile with anything in his training. That night, in front of several of the remaining workers gathered close around the fire, he finally asked Thomas Bell to describe exactly what this creature was supposed to look like, according to whatever stories he'd absorbed over a lifetime working camps up and down that river. Bell didn't hesitate for even a moment, as though he'd been waiting for someone to ask him properly all along. He said it had more legs than a frightened man could count in a hurry, each one longer than a grown man's arm from shoulder to fingertip. He said its body was built up out of one jointed section after another, dozens of them, covered over in something hard as armor plate, dark and wet looking even in dry weather, the way river stones stay dark long after the rain has passed. He said its head carried 2 curved fangs, each one long enough and sharp enough to punch clean through the side of a wooden barrel without much effort at all, and that its bite carried something in it beyond the wound itself, something that spread heat through a body long after the teeth had done their damage. He said one more thing that night that I hadn't heard from him before. He said that the old stories described it as patient beyond anything a hunting animal ought to be, that it did not simply attack and retreat the way a leopard or a crocodile might, snatching what it could and vanishing. He said it studied a camp first, sometimes for many nights running, learning the shape of it, learning where the men slept and where they kept their weapons and which paths they walked without thinking before it ever moved to take what it wanted. He said that was the reason his own people avoided certain stretches of forest entirely, rather than simply staying alert within them, because alertness was no defense against something that had already learned every one of your habits before you ever knew it was watching. Beaumont laughed the description off in front of the men, called it exactly the kind of folk tale a person invents when they've never had the benefit of a scientific education, the kind of story that grows taller and stranger with every retelling around every new fire, in every new camp. But later that same night, by lantern light, I saw him quietly sharpening the head of a boar spear with long, careful strokes of a whetstone, his face set in a concentration I hadn't seen on him before, and from that point onward he slept every night with a loaded pistol, tucked beneath the edge of his blanket, close enough that I noticed his hand rested near it even in sleep, twitching occasionally as though some part of him remained on watch, even while the rest of him dreamed. Over the 2 days that followed, the camp began to come apart at the seams, and not because I or anyone else gave the order for it. Several of our river workers quit outright, walking off towards the distant villages without waiting to collect wages still owed to them, which told me more about the depth of their fear than anything Thomas Bell had ever said sitting by the fire. I tried to stop a few of them, offered extra pay, offered anything I could think of to keep enough hands on the crew to make the season worthwhile, and not one of them so much as slowed down to consider it. One older man, before he left, took me by the arm and told me, in halting but perfectly clear English, that money spent by a dead man was worth exactly nothing, and that I should think very carefully about what I was still doing there myself. The men who chose to stay stopped sleeping in their individual tents altogether and started dragging their bedding into a tight, close circle around the central fire instead, weapons kept within easy reach, nobody willing to risk being caught alone in the dark, even for the length of a short walk to relieve themselves. We built the fire higher than usual each night, burning through wood faster than we could easily replace it, and posted 2 men on watch at all times instead of the usual one. Though I noticed even the men on watch kept their backs to the fire and their eyes fixed hard on the tree line, as though sitting close to the light itself was no longer enough to feel safe. We lost a second man on the 6th night, a quiet river worker named Isaiah, who had been with the outfit longer than almost anyone besides Bell himself. He had gone no further than the edge of the mule pen, close enough to camp that nobody thought to worry when he stepped away for a few minutes in the deep hours of the night. When one of the watchmen finally noticed he hadn't returned, we searched the pen and the ground immediately surrounding it and found nothing at all. No pail this time, no obvious point of departure, only again those same long grooves pressed into the earth near the fence line, still fresh, still glistening faintly under our lantern light. Isaiah's absence hit the camp harder than I expected. He had been well liked, steady, the kind of man other men naturally look to for calm in difficult moments, and losing him without so much as a scream to mark the moment left everyone shaken in a way that felt different from the fear that had followed Crow's disappearance. It felt for the first time like the beginning of a count, rather than an isolated tragedy, and I remembered, without wanting to, what Bell had told me about groups of 3. And the forest itself had changed around us during all of this, in a way that crept up on me, slowly enough that I didn't recognize what I was noticing until it had already fully arrived. The birds that always filled the canopy at first light had gone somewhere else entirely and taken their noise with them. The insects that swarmed thick and constant around our lantern light every single dusk, without fail, had simply stopped coming, night after night, until the absence itself became its own kind of sound. A silence with real weight and texture to it. The sort of silence that presses against a man's ears, the way deep water presses against his chest. In 6 years in that country, I had never once experienced a night where the insect life around a lit lantern went completely and totally still, and it unsettled something in me far deeper than I ever let show in front of the men. Thomas Bell told me plainly, without any theatre in his voice at all, that the silence meant it was close. He said it had likely been close for days already by that point, circling rather than striking outright the way it eventually would, the way certain large snakes will circle prey they aren't yet ready to take all at once, waiting patiently for exactly the right moment to close the distance and take everything it could manage in a single decisive strike. On the 7th night, the night before everything finally broke apart entirely, I had what I can only describe as a near miss, though at the time I convinced myself it was nothing more than exhaustion playing tricks with my eyes. I had gone to check the eastern edge of the camp, past where the last of the felled timber lay stacked and waiting to be hauled, and in the deep shadow beyond the reach of our fire, I saw something shift, low and long, moving parallel to the tree line rather than toward it, as though it were pacing the boundary of our camp the way a man might pace the edge of a room he wasn't yet ready to enter. I raised my lantern, and the shape was gone before the light could properly reach it, gone with a speed and a silence that no animal of that size should have been capable of. I stood there for a long while afterward, lantern held out shaking slightly in my hand, listening to absolutely nothing at all. And when I finally returned to the fire, I said nothing to anyone about what I'd seen, because saying it out loud would have made it real in a way I still, even then, wasn't prepared to accept. I did not sleep at all that night. Neither, I suspect, did most of the camp. The following evening, the 8th, since Crow had first gone missing, was the night the silence finally broke completely, and it is the part of this story I still find hardest to put into any proper order. Even now, even after telling it as many times as I have. I was sitting by the fire with my rifle laid flat across my knees, too restless and too frightened to even attempt sleep. When I first noticed that the silence around camp had gone total, In a way, it hadn't quite managed even on the worst of the previous nights. No insects calling anywhere in the darkness. No frogs sounding off from the direction of the creek. Not even the low, constant hum of the canopy that a man in that country eventually stops noticing altogether, right up until the precise moment it vanishes, and the absence of it hits him all at once, like a held breath finally let go after far too long. I remember sitting there in that unnatural stillness and feeling the hair rise slowly along the back of my neck before my mind had even fully caught up to why it should. Some older and more animal part of me understanding the danger before the rest of me had finished working it out. Then I heard something moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing, slow and deliberate, closer than anything had come before. At first, I told myself it was a man, moving low and careful through the brush, perhaps one of the workers who'd left in the last day returning after some change of heart. Then I saw the branches shaking in a long rolling pattern that no set of human footsteps could ever produce, a motion too continuous, too fluid, and I understood that whatever was coming toward us was moving close to the ground, and was far too long, far too unbroken in its motion to be any person walking upright on two legs. Beside me, Thomas Bell had gone completely still, his hand halfway to the knife at his belt, his eyes fixed on the same shaking branches I was watching. When it finally crawled into the light thrown by our fire, I understood at last, completely, and without any room left for doubt, exactly what Thomas Bell had been trying to tell me from the very first night. He'd sat turning that piece of wood over in his hands. It was a centipede, though the word feels almost like an insult when I use it now, considering the small, harmless household pest most people picture the moment they hear it spoken aloud. This creature was longer than our loaded supply wagon parked at the far edge of the clearing, its body built from one dark segment after another, dozens of them in a long, unbroken chain, each section covered in a hard, glossy plating the deep, wet brown of freshly turned soil after rain. Beneath that segmented body, legs moved in a smooth, churning rhythm that carried the whole enormous length of it forward, far faster than anything that size had any right to move. Faster than I could have believed possible if I hadn't been watching it happen with my own eyes. Two long antennae, each easily longer than a grown man's outstretched arm, swept slowly back and forth through the smoke-thick air in front of it, tasting the fire, tasting the fear rolling off every man still standing in that clearing, reading us the way a man might read a map he'd already memorized, and at the front of that terrible length sat a head fitted with two curved fangs, catching the firelight in a wet gleam, each one easily the length of a full hunting knife blade, dark fluid welling faintly at the tips even from that distance. Beside me, Bell whispered, so low I almost missed it beneath the roaring of my own pulse, that it had been circling our camp and watching us for many nights running now, learning us the way his story said it would, and that tonight, at long last, it had finally decided it knew us well enough to feed. For one impossibly long moment, nobody in that camp moved at all. The creature held perfectly still at the edge of the firelight, antennae sweeping slowly back and forth, and I remember thinking, with a strange detached clarity that only comes in moments of true terror, that it was giving us one last chance to run before it began. Then someone screamed, and everything after that arrived too fast and too tangled for me to lay it out in any tidy order, even now, even after telling this story more times than I can count. Men were shouting and scattering in every direction at once, tents overturning as bodies crashed against guide ropes in blind panic. I raised my rifle and put shot after shot directly into that long armoured body, and watched every single round do nothing but skip harmlessly off the hard plating, the way a thrown stone glances off a stone wall without leaving so much as a mark, without so much as slowing the thing down. It surged forward with a speed that seemed to defy the sheer bulk of it, and I watched two men who had been standing near the mule pen simply vanish beneath the sudden churn of legs and armoured body. Their cries cut short so abruptly that the silence following them felt like a physical blow to my chest. Tents collapsed inward around me, one after another, canvas folding down over whatever had been standing beneath it a moment before, and I heard, somewhere off to my right, a sound I will never be able to properly describe to anyone who wasn't there to hear it, a wet, grinding sound followed immediately by a silence so total it seemed to swallow the very memory of the noise that had come before it. Dr. Beaumont, of all people, the same man who had spent days insisting there had to be some rational catalogued explanation for all of it, charged forward with his sharpened boar spear held level and drove the point hard into one of the narrow joints between segments, exactly where the plating had to bend and give a little to allow the body beneath it to move at all. I saw the spear sink deep, saw dark fluid well up thick around the wound, and the creature reared back with a violence that sent an entire stack of supply crates crashing sideways across the clearing, wood splintering apart in every direction. For one brief, terrible moment, I thought Beaumont might actually survive what he'd just done. Then the creature's head snapped around with a speed that seemed to bend the very air, and I saw one of those curved fangs catch the lantern light as it came down. And I did not see what happened after that because Thomas Bell had grabbed hold of my arm and was hauling me bodily towards the tree line, shouting something I couldn't fully make out over the screaming and the crashing and the low, wet, grinding sound that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once now. I lost sight of Bell almost immediately once we broke apart in the smoke and confusion, each of us running blind in whatever direction seemed to offer the best chance of surviving the next few seconds. I ran without any clear plan at all, simply moving away from the worst of the noise, until I found myself near the stacked supply crates by the felled timber pile, and some part of my mind still capable of rational thought recognized the crate built sturdy enough for storing salted meat, and I forced my body inside it, pulling the heavy lid down over myself and wedging a loose plank hard against the underside to hold it shut from within, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the plank twice before it finally caught. I don't know that I can properly describe what it was like waiting inside that crate in the absolute dark, and I have tried, every time I have told this story, to find better words for it than I ever quite manage. The smell of old brine and rough splintering wood pressed in close around me on every side, thick enough to taste at the back of my throat. Total, absolute darkness, so complete that I couldn't tell whether my eyes were open or shut, whether I had simply lost the ability to perceive light at all in that moment, or whether the crate itself blocked out every last trace of it. My own breath sounded impossibly, dangerously loud in that enclosed space, loud enough that I pressed the back of my hand hard against my mouth just to muffle it, terrified that even the smallest sound might carry to whatever was still moving through the wreckage outside. Outside, I could hear the creature working its way through what remained of the camp. And it wasn't thrashing wildly the way I might have expected from a wild animal in the grip of a feeding frenzy, wasn't behaving at all like any predator I had ever encountered before that night. It moved instead with a strange, patient deliberateness, working through the wreckage of one collapsed tent after another in careful, unhurried sequence, as though it understood precisely where a frightened man was most likely to hide himself and meant to check every possibility in turn before moving on to the next, the way a methodical man might search a house room by room, confident that nothing inside it could escape him, no matter how long he took. I heard it pause near what I guessed was the ruin of my own tent, heard the specific sound of canvas being dragged and torn, heard the low, wet, grinding sound again, closer this time, and I bit down hard on the back of my own hand to keep from making a sound, tears running freely down my face, though I hadn't been aware of starting to cry. At one point it passed close enough to my crate that I felt more than heard its legs scrape hard against the outer wood. A long, dragging scratch that seemed to stretch on far longer than it possibly could have, each individual leg finding purchase against the wood in a rhythm that felt, impossibly, almost curious, as though it were testing the crate the way a man might knock against a hollow wall to see what lay behind it. I did not draw a single breath again until that sound had faded fully into the distance beyond the clearing, my chest burning with the effort of holding perfectly, completely still. I lost every sense of time crouched there in that darkness, listening to my own heartbeat hammering so hard in my ears that I was certain, at several points, that the sound alone would be enough to give me away. It felt, in the moment, like hours had passed me by. An endless stretch of darkness and terror with no clear beginning and no visible end. Looking back on it honestly, I doubt it could have been much more than one, though I have never been entirely certain, and some part of me has never fully trusted the passage of time since that night. Gradually, so gradually I almost didn't trust it at first, the sounds outside began to change. The grinding and the crashing and the low, terrible movement through the wreckage grew more distant, then more distant still, until at last there was nothing left outside my crate but a silence even deeper than the one that had come before the attack. A silence that felt somehow spent, the way a room feels different after a great storm has finally passed through it. I stayed inside that crate long after the sounds had stopped entirely, too afraid to trust that the danger had truly gone, until the faint grey light of approaching dawn began working its way into the gaps and seams of the wood around me. Only then did I finally force the lid open with hands that would barely obey me, and climbed out into a camp I barely recognized as the same place I had fallen asleep in, hopeful and restless in equal measure, only days before. Every tent lay flattened or torn clean apart, canvas shredded and scattered across the churned and blood-dark earth. Crates were overturned and gutted across the length of the clearing, their contents spilled and half buried in ground that had been torn up as though a plough had passed through it in the night. The cook fire had burned all the way down to cold grey ash, sometime in the deep hours, unattended and forgotten. And there were no bodies anywhere at all, not Samuel Crow's, not Isaiah's, not Dr. Beaumont's, not one single body from among the men who had never made it to any kind of shelter that night, no matter how carefully I searched, and I searched every corner of that ruined clearing twice over, calling out names until my voice broke and gave out entirely. What I found instead, spread out across the ruined camp, were those same long, deep grooves from before, except now there were dozens upon dozens of them radiating outward from the wrecked camp in every possible direction before disappearing one by one into the dark tree line, as though whatever had done this had finally taken everything it wanted and simply walked away, unhurried, satisfied, in no fear at all of anything we might have done to stop it. Near the cold ashes of the dead fire, I found Thomas Bell's cooking knife lying flat in the dirt, perfectly clean, completely undamaged, with no sign of Bell himself anywhere in the wreckage stretched out around it. I stood over that knife for a long while, unable to make myself pick it up before I finally forced myself to keep searching. It was near the far edge of the clearing, close to where the mule pen had once stood, that I finally found him. Thomas Bell was alive, though barely, half buried beneath the collapsed section of fencing, one leg twisted badly beneath him at an angle that told me it was broken before he ever said a word. He had a long, deep gash along one side of his ribs, not a bite, I realized with some small measure of relief, but a wound from being thrown or dragged against something hard and sharp in the chaos. He was conscious, though only barely, his breathing shallow and wet-sounding in a way I didn't like at all, and when he saw my face above him, he managed something close to a smile, though it cost him visibly to produce it. He told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he'd made it as far as the old hollow tree trunk, at the tree line, the same one none of the workers would sleep near, and that he'd hidden inside it through the worst of the attack, close enough to hear everything and unable to do anything at all to stop it. He said the creature had passed within a few feet of him at one point and simply moved on, as though the tree trunk itself was somehow beneath its notice, and he did not have any explanation for why, only a deep and abiding gratitude that it was so. I did what I could for his injuries with what remained of our medical supplies, most of which had been scattered or destroyed in the attack, splinting his leg as best I was able with broken tent poles and torn strips of canvas, binding the wound along his ribs tightly enough to slow the bleeding, though I could see even then that it was not enough. Not really. Not in country like this, days from anything resembling proper medical care. We could not stay in that clearing. Whatever mercy had spared us both through the worst of that night was not something either of us trusted to hold a second time, and so, with the sun barely above the tree line, I gathered what supplies I could carry, built a rough litter to drag Belle behind me, and started walking, following the river back towards the nearest settlement rather than risk the narrower game trails cutting through the trees on either side, trails I now understood far too well might not be as empty as they appeared. The journey out took the better part of 4 days, though I have never been entirely certain of the count, given how little either of us slept along the way. Belle's condition worsened steadily despite everything I tried, the wound along his ribs growing hot and swollen despite my efforts to keep it clean, his breathing growing more laboured with each passing day. He remained lucid for most of it, and in the long hours of dragging that litter along the riverbank, he told me more of what he knew, more of the old stories he'd never shared before, as though some part of him understood he wouldn't have many more chances to pass them along to anyone. He told me that the old stories described more than just the creature itself. They described a pattern to its hunting, a long, slow cycle spanning years rather than single seasons, in which it moved from one stretch of forest to another, feeding heavily for a short time, before withdrawing again into whatever depths it called home, sometimes for so long that entire generations grew up believing the stories were nothing more than stories, only for the pattern to begin again decades later in some new clearing, some new camp of people who had never heard the warnings at all. He told me he believed, though he had no way to prove it, that our camp had simply been unlucky enough to settle into a clearing that sat directly along one of those old paths at exactly the wrong point in that terrible, patient cycle. On the third night of our journey, camped in a rough shelter along the riverbank, Belle's fever broke fully, and for a while I allowed myself to hope that the worst had passed. He slept more peacefully than he had since the attack, and I sat up through the night watching over him, rifle across my knees, exactly as it had been on that first terrible evening, though this time my vigilance felt different, felt like something I was doing for another person rather than simply for my own survival. He did not wake the next morning. I buried Thomas Belle as best I could along that riverbank, marking the spot with stones I gathered from the shallows, and I sat beside that grave for longer than I probably should have, given how far I still had to travel, and how little certainty I had about my own safety in that country. I told him, out loud, foolishly, that I was sorry I hadn't believed him sooner, that I would carry what he'd taught me for the rest of my life, however long that turned out to be. I don't know if any part of him heard it. I have chosen, in the years since, to believe that some part of him did. I completed the remainder of the journey alone, and I will not pretend those final 2 days passed without their own share of terror, every unfamiliar sound in the underbrush sending my heart into my throat, every long shadow across the trail freezing me in place until I could confirm, with as much certainty as the failing light allowed, that it was nothing more than a shadow. But nothing followed me out of that forest, or if it did, it chose not to show itself, and I finally stumbled into a small river settlement on the evening of the 6th day since the attack, half-starved, badly sunburned, and barely coherent enough to explain to the startled people who found me exactly what had happened to my camp. They did not believe me, not fully, not at first, and I cannot entirely blame them for it. I told the story as plainly and as calmly as I could manage, leaving out nothing, and I watched the same expressions cross their faces that I imagine are crossing yours right now. That particular blend of pity and doubt that people reserve for a man who has clearly suffered something terrible, whether or not they believe his account of exactly what that something was. A search party was eventually organised. Weeks later, once word had travelled far enough to reach people with the authority and the resources to act on it. What they found when they finally reached that clearing was consistent with everything I had told them and explained nothing at all. An abandoned, wrecked camp. No bodies. Long, strange marks in the earth that had mostly weathered away by the time anyone arrived to properly document them. The official report, as I understand it, attributed the incident to an attack by wild animals, most likely a combination of large predators taking advantage of a poorly defended camp, and left it at that, filed away and largely forgotten within a year or two. I never went back into that stretch of forest. Not once, in all the years that followed. I left that country entirely within the year, and I have spent the better part of my life since then, in places about as far from a dense, humid jungle as a man can reasonably arrange to live, though I will admit that distance has never fully done what I hoped it would. I still keep a rifle within reach at night, wherever I happen to be sleeping. I still find myself, on certain evenings, glancing towards whatever tree line or hedge or distant dark stand of trees happens to be visible from wherever I'm standing, counting something only I can see, exactly the way I once watched Thomas Bell do on our very first evenings in that clearing, back before I understood what he was counting or why. I'll leave you with one more thing before I let this story rest, and then you can decide for yourself what to make of it. Years later, long after I had left that country behind for good and settled somewhere far from any river worth naming, I was walking through an open market in a small coastal town, past stalls selling vegetables and cloth and fresh fish laid out on beds of ice, when I happened to glance down and saw a single groove pressed into the soft mud beside a vegetable stand. Narrow, evenly spaced, utterly, sickeningly familiar in a way that stopped the breath dead in my chest for a long moment. I didn't stop to look at it twice. I kept walking faster than I meant to, my heart hammering the way it had in that crate all those years before, and to this day I have never once looked back to see whether anything was following. I think about Samuel Crowe often, about the letter of recommendation I promised him and never got the chance to write. I think about Thomas Bell, about the stories he tried to give me long before I was ready to hear them, and about the quiet grave I left for him along a riverbank, half a world away from anywhere either of us ever called home. And I think, more than I would like to admit, about that long, patient cycle Bell described to me on our last night together, the one spanning years rather than seasons, the one that eventually returns to every clearing it has ever visited, sooner or later, whether the people living there remember the old warnings or not. I don't know how much time that cycle allows between one visit and the next. I have never been brave enough or foolish enough to go back and find out. But I think about it anyway, most nights, in the quiet moments right before sleep finally takes me. And I wonder, every single time, whose fire it's circling now.